un legado desaparecido, un nombre borrado, y Miss Marple ve lo que otros pasan por alto. Bienvenidos a Misterios Clásicos. Soy su anfitrión, Lorenzo A. Esta comunidad, amante de los misterios, sigue creciendo. Déjenme un comentario y díganme, ¿desde dónde me escuchan? Vuestras voces hacen que todo esto merezca la pena. Me encanta saber de cada uno de vosotros. Ahora, empecemos. Una fortuna desaparecida. Un hombre que nadie recuerda. Bienvenidos a Misterios Clásicos. Soy su anfitrión, Gabriela May. Encanta ver cómo crece esta comunidad. Dime desde dónde nos escuchas hoy. Tu presencia hace que esto sea aún más especial. Calm NCE. Most. The sun shone with a deceptive warmth over the village of Lower Davenish that early June afternoon, casting dappled light across the tidy hedgerows and flowering rosebeds of the vicarage garden. It was the sort of day that seemed designed for lemonade in cut crystal glasses, delicate cucumber sandwiches, and the latest murmured scandals wrapped in politeness. Mrs. Margaret Calthorpe, wife of the Reverend Harold Calthorpe, had spared no effort for the summer fete. The bunting fluttered along the edges of the lawn, small tables were set with white cloths and china cups, and local ladies mingled in their Sunday best, fanning themselves gently as they discussed the ongoing shortage of decent marmalade at the grocer's. It was an event Miss Marple would not normally attend with particular enthusiasm. She disliked anything that involved standing too long or feigning interest in prize-winning scones, but she had made an exception this year. Word had spread that the vicarage would be hosting a visitor of rare distinction, Miss Imogen Granville, newly returned from Canada, claiming descent from the long-forgotten branch of the Folliot family, former owners of Davenish Grange. Quite the surprise. Mrs. Banburyfinch had told Miss Marple at the greengrocer's only days before. The Grange has been unoccupied for decades, and now some foreign young lady comes waltzing in, claiming she's the sole heiress. Says she's inherited the place. I don't know how true it all is, but she's here now, staying at the inn until the lawyers finish up. Imogen Granville, when Miss Marple saw her for the first time that afternoon, was younger than she expected, perhaps in her late 20s, tall, striking in an unpolished way, with auburn hair and a self-assured bearing that didn't quite fit into the village's gentle rhythm. She wore a wide-brimmed straw hat, tilted fashionably, and carried herself with the confidence of someone unused to being questioned. Rather modern, isn't she? Whispered Miss Hartnell to Colonel Easterbrook's wife. Not the sort of heiress one imagined. No pearls, no poise. Miss Marple, seated beneath the shade of a chestnut tree, sipped her tea and said nothing, but she watched. She watched Imogen as she laughed a little too easily at the vicar's jokes, and then went quiet when Margaret Calthorpe asked about her family in Canada. She noted the slight hesitation when the name Folliot was mentioned by the local historian, Mr. Crane, and she noticed, too, the way young Hugh Partridge, one of the trustees of the estate, lingered around her, all nervous charm and awkward glances. Yes, Miss Marple murmured softly into her cup, there's more to this than a few roses and Devonshire cream. What struck her, oddly enough, was not Imogen's presence, but the expression on Mrs. Rosalind Lemmer's face. When the heiress was introduced to the crowd, Rosalind, the spinster daughter of the late Dr. Lemmer, had lived in Lower Davenish all her life, and rarely involved herself in social events. That she had come to the fete at all was curious. That she had turned positively ashen when introduced to Miss Granville was more curious still. But, before any further observations could be made, a scream shattered the afternoon calm. It came from the far side of the garden, near the trellised roses. A young maidaless from the inn was rushing toward the centre lawn, pale and breathless. her apron streaked with soil. "It's her," she cried, pointing back toward the path. "She's lying there. She's not moving. Oh, please, someone help." A flurry of motion followed. People rushed past folding chairs and over garden borders. Colonel Easterbrook took charge, instructing the Reverend to call for Dr. Penrose. Mrs. Calthorpe gasped and clutched her chest. Miss Marple, however, remained seated. She placed her teacup gently on the saucer, then stood and walked with unhurried grace in the direction of the trellis. A small crowd had already formed, huddled around the motionless figure of a woman sprawled in the shaded grass, her hat fallen to one side. It was Imogen Granville. Her face was pale, her lips slightly parted, her eyes open. Miss Marple glanced briefly at her and then down at the cup on the ground nearby. "A teacup, not hers, is she?" murmured Mrs. Lemmer, frozen at the edge of the scene. Dr. Penrose, who had been called away from a game of croquet nearby, was already kneeling beside the body. He looked up after a moment and nodded solemnly. "I'm afraid she's dead." Gasps rose like wind in the trees. "A stroke?" asked someone. "Poison," whispered another. Miss Marple, eyes still on the body, said nothing. But deep in her mind, already, she had begun the inventory. A face drained of color, a teacup, a young woman with secrets, and a village full of people with far too much to hide. Not for the first time in her life, Miss Marple knew what others did not. The game had begun. The fate had not quite ended, but no one stayed for another slice of sponge cake. The music had ceased. The laughter had long since drained from the vicarage garden. Instead, villagers gathered in tight clusters, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes flicking toward the trellised corner where Imogen Granville had fallen so suddenly from life into death. Mrs. Calthorpe, flustered and pale, had retreated indoors, aided by her husband, the Reverend Harold, who did his best to maintain composure for the sake of the village. But his prayers, murmured under breath, felt as tremulous as the teacups still abandoned on their saucers. The constable from the next parish, a Mr. Reeves, had arrived with impressive urgency, though his cheeks remained flushed from the hurried cycle ride. He quickly secured the area with a loop of rope and stern glances, declaring no one was to leave until statements were collected. Miss Marple remained by the rose border, having quietly stepped back after Dr. Penrose confirmed the young woman's death. She made no grand pronouncements. In fact, she seemed altogether rather preoccupied with the positioning of a folding chair that had been knocked slightly off alignment. "Such a terrible thing, Jane," came the clipped voice of Miss Hartnell, who stood beside her, wringing her gloves. "It's the tea, mark my words. These modern sorts, coffee and cigarettes and all kinds of foreign habits. Her constitution wasn't used to a proper Devon cream tea." Miss Marple gave a gentle nod, her gaze still lingering on the chair. "Or perhaps," she said lightly, "her constitution wasn't the only thing unsuited to the village." Miss Hartnell blinked. "What do you mean?" But Miss Marple only smiled and shifted her attention to the nearby rose bushes. She plucked a dried petal from one and held it thoughtfully before letting it fall to the grass. Mr. Reeves began calling names for statements, beginning with those closest to the scene. Colonel Easterbrook was the first summoned, his account clipped, and efficient, if not entirely helpful. "Didn't see much," he grumbled, turned to fetch a slice of Dundee cake, and next thing, the maids screaming. "Can't make much of it, really." Then came the inn-maid, Alice, trembling as she recounted finding Miss Granville on the ground. "I brought her a second cup, just like she asked," Alice said, her voice catching. "But when I came back with it, she was already lying there like she'd just collapsed." "What sort of tea?" Reeves asked. "Darjeeling," She asked for it especially. Said the regular blend was too muddy. Reeves scribbled something into his notebook with theatrical importance. Miss Marple, who had wandered over near enough to hear, tilted her head. "Did she drink it?" the constable asked. Alice shook her head. "No, sir, I found it spilled by her side. Still warm." The interviews continued. Mrs. Lemmer, when questioned, responded with the vague unease of someone who regretted coming. "Altogether, I hardly spoke to her. She introduced herself, but I was too warm to stay long. I don't recall what she said exactly." Miss Marple, sitting now on the same folding chair she had straightened earlier, watched Rosalind's face closely. There was something not quite right about her, tone too indifferent to cold. Not shock nor grief, but something like retreat. A woman withdrawing from a memory she did not wish to recall. It was Mrs. Banbury Finch who, in her usual confident tone, provided a more colourful version of events. "I thought she was charming," she declared. "Yes, very direct, of course, but that's how they are abroad. She told me she'd inherited the Grange from her grattant, one of the last Folliots. Imagine that. Years abroad, and yet still linked to our own sleepy little corner. Though, I must say, not everyone seemed pleased by her return." The constable perked up. "Oh, who didn't seem pleased?" Mrs. Banbury Finch waved a hand vaguely. "Oh, you know how it is, old names stir up old feelings. Some think she's an impostor. Others say she has no right to the house at all. You should ask Mr. Partridge. Really, he's been the estate's solicitor for years. Seemed dreadfully on edge today." Indeed, Hugh Partridge had not said a word since the incident. He sat at a table near the French doors, staring at the grass with such focus one might think the answer to life's mysteries lay buried there. Reeves approached him next. Partridge stood slowly, adjusting his cuffs. His voice was low, but firm. "Yes, I knew Miss Granville," he began. "Not well. We exchanged several letters after she made her claim. I've been working with the family trust since her supposed great-aunt passed 2 years ago. Her arrival, though unexpected, seemed legitimate on paper." "On paper," Reeves repeated. Partridge hesitated. "There were documents, birth certificates, letters, all appeared genuine. I was in the process of verifying the estate transfer. That was why she was staying at the inn." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Her eyes flicked to the Colonel, then to Rosalind Lemmer, who sat at the garden's edge now, fingering the brooch on her lapel as if it grounded her. As dusk crept into the garden and the constable finished collecting accounts, the villagers began drifting back to their homes, their whispers trailing behind them like threads of smoke. The murder had disrupted more than an afternoon of tea and social chatter. It had pierced something deeper, something that had lain undisturbed for decades. Miss Marple walked slowly with Mrs. Hartnell toward the church lane. "I never thought we'd have a murder in Lower Davenish," Hartnell muttered, still shaken. "Oh, I dare say it was only a matter of time," Miss Marple said, folding her hands neatly in front of her. Hartnell blinked at her. "Human nature," Miss Marple added quietly. "It ripens in all climates, even the mildest ones. And where inheritances are concerned, people are never quite as peaceful as they pretend." As they reached the gate, Miss Marple turned back for one final look at the vicarage lawn. The folding chairs stood abandoned, the bunting drooping slightly in the cooling air. A faint breeze rustled the rose bushes where Imogen Granville had fallen, and the trellis cast a long, jagged shadow across the grass. She made a small mental note. The tea, the chair, and the way Rosalind Lemmer had looked when she thought no one was watching. By the following morning, the shock of the murder had settled over Lower Davenish like dew on morning, heather chilling, persistent, and impossible to brush away. The village, though modest in size and temperament, was a seasoned veteran when it came to managing scandal. It had weathered elopements, drunken choirmasters, and once even a schoolmistress who'd vanished to the continent with the baker's boy. But murder, that was a different sort of trouble altogether. At the High Street post office, conversations were whispered behind raised newspapers. At the grocer's, hands paused above bags of flour and barley as customers leaned closer, exchanging theories with quiet intensity. And at the plough and lantern, where the older men gathered under the pretext of morning drafts, it was agreed that such a thing would never have happened in the days before electricity. Miss Marple, as was her custom, declined to engage in the more flamboyant discussions. Instead, she took a measured walk through the village lanes after breakfast, exchanging polite nods, but collecting far more than gossip. She stopped at the churchyard to observe the monument to the Folliot family, its worn stone cross partly hidden by ivy, and then continued past the old blacksmith's, where the forge had long since gone cold. Her destination was clear. At precisely 11:30, she arrived at the Devonish solicitor's office. The brass plaque beside the blue-painted door read, "Partridge and Finch, Solicitors and Commissioners for Oaths." The interior was exactly as one might expect, a warren of dark wood furniture, shelves of crumbling ledgers, and the faint aroma of paper and ink. Hugh Partridge himself looked little better than the furniture, unshaven, his collar wilted from poor sleep. He blinked in surprise at the sight of Miss Marple, but quickly stood. "Miss Marple," he said, gesturing vaguely toward a chair, "I suppose you've come to ask questions. Everyone else has." "Oh no," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, settling herself into the seat. "I simply wanted to clarify a few things about the estate, purely for my own understanding. You know how things wander about in one's memory after a shock." He ran a hand through his hair, then perched awkwardly on the edge of his desk. "I don't know how much help I'll be. Everything's rather a mess. But you are familiar with the Folliot family, are you not?" she asked gently. "The estate has been closed up for some time." "Yes, ever since old Mrs. Folliot passed 3 years ago now. She was the last one anyone knew of. No direct heirs. The estate went into a trust. I was named one of the trustees. And then Miss Granville appeared," Miss Marple said, her voice still gentle, claiming descent. Partridge nodded. "From a younger sister of Mrs. Folliot who'd gone to Canada in the 1890s, a forgotten branch. She had documents, letters, birth records. Canadian officials had even verified some of it. And you believed her." "I wanted to," he admitted. "She had spirit, intelligence. She was polite but determined. And well, it was more comforting to imagine someone wanted the house than to see it fall into rot." Miss Marple observed him a moment before asking, "Did anyone object?" He hesitated, then said, "Rosalind Lemmer, quietly, of course. She came to see me 2 weeks ago. She didn't believe Imogen was who she said she was." Miss Marple's eyes twitched the smallest degree. "Did she say why?" "She claimed to remember something from her youthsome rumor about the Canadian branch being severed for, well, dishonorable reasons. She hinted at a scandal, but she had no proof. And frankly, I wasn't inclined to entertain idle village myths." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Even so," she said softly, "those myths often have a seed of truth. The difficulty lies in the sifting." Partridge looked at her warily. "I'm just trying to see the legal side through. But now with her dead the whole thing may fall apart. Unless," Miss Marple said with the faintest suggestion of curiosity, "she had already signed something." His head turned sharply. "I'm sorry, had she signed anything?" Miss Marple repeated. "A will, a transfer agreement. Anything that might affect the estate's future. He exhaled. There was a preliminary agreement, he admitted, granting her temporary authority over the house pending final probate. But nothing final. Nothing that would hold if her identity were disproved. Miss Marple stood. "Thank you, Mr. Partridge. That's most enlightening. I do hope you'll get some rest soon." She departed with the same quiet air with which she'd entered, leaving Hugh Partridge staring into the gloom of his office as if it might contain answers he had overlooked. That afternoon, the village hosted an impromptu memorial gathering at the church hall, organized hastily by the vicar's wife. It was not so much a eulogy as a collective attempt at civility in the face of confusion. No one knew quite how to grieve Imogen Granville, for she had barely been known. Miss Marple attended, seated near the back, watching rather than participating. She noted who spoke and who did not. She noted the slightly pinched expression of Mrs. Lemmer, who sat stiffly beside her knitting bag but did not knit, and she particularly noted a strange exchange between the maid Alice and a delivery boy from the bakery, both of whom hovered near the tea urn, whispering too intently. Later, on her way home, Miss Marple took a detour along Orchard Lane, where the oldest houses of Lower Davenish lined the road like weathered teeth. One of these belonged to Mrs. Rosalind Lemmer. Miss Marple was not surprised when the door opened. Before she had even reached the step, "Miss Marple," Rosalind said coolly, "I rather thought you might come. Then perhaps you'll permit me a few minutes." The drawing-room was dark, despite the summer light outside. Heavy curtains muted everything, as did the old Persian rug and the rows of medical books that still filled the shelves, a relic of Dr. Lemmer's long-deceased presence. "You knew something about her," Miss Marple said after tea was served, "and declined something you chose not to say." Rosalind turned away toward the mantelpiece. "She reminded me of someone," she said finally. "That's all. Someone you once knew." Rosalind nodded. "A girl who lived here briefly during the war. Her name was Evelyn. She said she was a cousin distant, from overseas. But my father, he didn't believe her. She was sent away. Quietly, I never saw her again." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "And you believe Miss Granville was Evelyn's daughter?" "I don't know what I believe," Rosalind whispered, "but if she was, then she came back into a place that once spat her mother out. There are old sins in this village, forgotten by some, not by all." Miss Marple stood slowly. "Thank you, Rosalind. That is quite enough for today." Outside, the clouds had gathered above Lower Davenish, casting the afternoon in hues of pearl and grey. The air was still. A village in mourning, perhaps, but not only for the girl who had died. Miss Marple walked steadily back to her cottage, her thoughts organized as tidily as her lace doilies. One truth remained ever fixed in her mind. The past had never truly gone. It had simply waited, buried just beneath the surface, for someone to return and disturb it. The following morning brought with it a soft, almost reluctant light that filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room. She sat with her hands wrapped gently around a delicate china cup, its contents now lukewarm. The gentle ticking of the clock on the mantel was the only sound, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards as the old house settled into the day. Outside, the village of Lower Davenish appeared almost apologetic in the wake of the tragedy. Shopkeepers opened half an hour late. Curtains remained drawn longer than usual. Even the bird-song seemed subdued, as though the very hedgerows were holding their breath. Miss Marple had lived through wars, rationing, and more than one scandal involving the Women's Institute, but she knew well that murder did something different to a community. It didn't simply win, it changed the way people looked at one another. Trust grew quieter. Smiles turned brittle. Old memories stirred like dust under a rising wind. She set the cup down carefully and reached for her notebook, the same one she used for parish meetings and knitting patterns. On the first page she wrote, "Who was Imogen Granville? Arrived from Canada, claimed inheritance to Davenish Grange, provided documents, verified. Mentioned as possible daughter of Evelyn, per our lemma, dead after village fete, Darjeeling tea, or something else." She underlined the last point and tapped her pencil against the margin. Then she turned to the next page and began another list. Noted reactions at the fete. Rosalind, lemma, pale, visibly shaken. Hugh Partridge, nervous, evasive. Alice in Mead, appeared frightened later. Mrs. Banbury Finch, curious but unaware. Colonel Easterbrook, indifferent, but well placed to observe it was time. She decided to pay a visit to the inn. The Blue Bell Inn was a 2-story coaching house with low beams, creaky staircases, and a reputation for serving the best haddock pie in 3 counties. Miss Marple, however, came not for the cooking, but for a quiet word with someone who knew the inn's recent guest better than most. Alice, the young maid, was found in the narrow back garden, pegging linens on the line, her fingers red from cold water despite the warming sun. Miss Marple approached with gentle footsteps. "My dear," she said kindly, "I do hope I'm not interrupting." Alice looked up, startled. "Oh, Miss Marple, no, not at all. I wondered if I might ask you a question or two. It's just that I keep going over what happened, and something still feels unsettled." Alice looked away toward the flapping sheets. "I still see her lying there," she murmured. "So sudden. She was laughing just a moment before." "You mentioned she asked for Darjeeling tea," Miss Marple prompted. Alice nodded. "Yes, ma'am. She said the usual blend was too strong, so I made a separate pot." Miss Marple tilted her head gently. "And that pot was it, in the kitchen with the others?" Alice hesitated. "No, I kept it aside. She was very particular, wanted it brewed precisely for minutes. I used a clean strainer, poured it straight into her cup myself." "Did anyone else touch the cup?" "Not that I saw." She paused. "Well, except when I brought it out, I set it on the tray with the other cups, just for a moment. Then I remembered hers, and switched them before going out to the garden." Miss Marple's brows lifted. "Switched them?" "Yes, because someone will. I think it was Colonel Easterbrook reached for a cup, and I thought he might take hers by mistake, so I moved hers to the side." "Ah," Miss Marple said quietly. "And do you recall if the Colonel had a cup after all?" "I believe he did, but not the same one." "Thank you, Alice. You've been very helpful, very careful to—" Alice gave a faint smile. "I liked her, you know. Miss Granville. She was odd but kind. Asked me where I wanted to travel, as if that were a normal thing to ask a girl like me. Said I had good hands, like a musician's." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Sometimes it only takes a few words to leave an impression." She left Alice to her linens and crossed the green to the village library, which had seen more activity in the past 2 days than it had all year. There, among the hushed murmurs and cracked spines, she found Mr. Crane, the village historian and tireless keeper of genealogies. "I was hoping you might indulge a small curiosity of mine," Miss Marple said with polite resolve as she joined him at the reading table. Of course," said Mr. Crane, always flattered by Miss Marple's interest. "Local history or scandal?" "A little of both, I'm afraid." Together they pored over old parish registers and yellowed estate letters. Mr. Crane, with evident pride, produced a ledger from the Folliot family archives, noting the birth of Mary Folliot in 1858 and her younger sister, Evelyn, in 1862. He pointed, Evelyn married a Mr. James Bowden of Halifax, Nova Scotia. In 1890, that line disappears after a few years. Rumors of disgrace, perhaps debt or political trouble. Difficult to say from this side of the Atlantic. Do you recall anyone else in the village mentioning Evelyn? Miss Marple asked. Rosalind Lemmer, he replied promptly. Her father was the village doctor. He might have been involved in whatever matter sent Evelyn away. Miss Marple thanked him and left shortly after, her thoughts quietly weaving threads together. On her way home, she passed the cottage of Mrs. Banbury Finch, whose lace curtains were twitching in their usual manner. Sure enough, a few steps later, the door opened. Jane, come in for a cup. You'll want to hear the latest. Inside, amidst a pot of oversteeped tea and a plate of slightly stale shortbread, Mrs. Banbury Finch relayed the newest twist in village chatter. Word is, she said in an excited whisper, Imogen or whoever she was, had been asking questions about the Granger's locked east wing, and about Rosalind Lemmer's father. Miss Marple's eyes flickered. What sort of questions? Oh, something about a nursemaid who vanished during the war. A girl named Edie or Elsie. You know how things get muddled. Miss Marple leaned back slightly in her chair. Yes, things did get muddled, especially when left long enough. As the sun dipped behind the trees that evening, Miss Marple sat once more in her quiet sitting room. Her notebook now bore new pages filled with scribbled thoughts. The east wing, locked since wartime, nursemaid named Elsie, vanished. Darjeeling tea, but who truly drank it? Documents from Canada, were they real or forged? And below it all, in slightly firmer script, the killer knew the past, and knew she might uncover it. Outside, a soft breeze stirred the garden roses. Inside, Miss Marple lifted her teacup once more and stared at the swirling leaves. It was an unseasonably cool Thursday when Miss Marple found herself once again at the gates of Davenish Grange. The house stood on a slight rise above the village, its gables and chimneys clawing toward the sky like the skeletal remains of a forgotten aristocracy. Though the gardens had long gone untended, nature had not yet reclaimed the house entirely. Ivy crept up the stone walls with the stealth of memory, and the cracked path bore the faded elegance of what must once have been a well-tended estate. Miss Marple had not come unannounced. Hugh Partridge had reluctantly agreed to escort her through the Grange, if only to appease the quiet but unmistakable pressure she applied in that most genteel of Waysunder, the guise of helpfulness, curiosity, and the shared need to understand. Only a brief look, he had said that morning at the solicitor's office, clearly worn by the week's events. And only the main rooms. The place hasn't been lived in for years. Now, as the heavy iron gate creaked open and they began the walk toward the house, a breeze stirred the nettles along the path. The main hall is structurally sound, Partridge said as they reached the portico. But most of the east wing is sealed. No heating, bad roof. Damp everywhere. No one's been inside in decades, except Imogen, perhaps. Miss Marple asked gently. He hesitated. She did ask. I told her it wasn't safe. She said it didn't frighten her. And did she go in, to your knowledge? His reply was slower now. I don't know. I can't say. Inside, the house exhaled cold air and silence. Dust hung like fine gauze in the streams of light slanting through leaded windows. The once grand hallway bore the scent of wood polish long since faded. Family portraits stared out from the walls, the eyes of Folliot's past rendered in oils, each more severe than the last. They walked past a shuttered ballroom, a narrow music room with a broken piano, and a library with rows of untouched books. She said she remembered stories of these rooms, Partridge murmured. Her mother told her bedtime tales about the silver candelabra and the green velvet curtains. Miss Marple stopped by the window. "And did you believe her, Mr. Partridge?" He looked at her, then away. "I wanted to. That's the truth. I wanted to believe someone still cared about this place." They reached the corridor leading to the east wing. The door at the end was oak, thick, with an old iron bolt across it. "Here," he said, stopping. "This is as far as I go." Miss Marple approached the door, her eyes moving over the hinges, the bolt, and the faint cobwebs dancing in the corners. She touched the edge of the handle. Was it locked? No, just bolted. From this side, we kept it closed, because of drafts. "May I?" Partridge hesitated, then nodded. Miss Marple slid the bolt and pushed. The door groaned open, revealing a corridor steeped in shadows and age. The air was different here, mustier, tinged with the bitter edge of mildew and old soap. The wallpaper had peeled in long curls, and a distant drip echoed faintly from somewhere beyond. Miss Marple stepped inside. Partridge remained in the threshold, reluctant to follow. The first room on the left was a nursery once cheerful, now grey with dust. A rocking horse stood mid-motion, its mane faded, its eyes dulled by time. Dolls with cracked faces stared blankly from a shelf. Miss Marple walked slowly, her eyes scanning not just the room but its atmosphere. The nursery had not been used in years, but the dust by the window had been disturbed recently. She traced a gloved finger across the cilius, a mark where someone had rested their hand. Not a week old. She moved on to the room at the end of the corridor. This one had been a bedroom. Sparse, austere. A narrow iron bed with a rusted frame, a single chair by the fireplace, a cracked mirror above the mantel, and on the wall, a faded photograph in a crooked frame. She leaned closer, a young woman in Edwardian dress, no name inscribed, but the jawline, the eyes. There was something eerily familiar about the features. Something that echoed in the face of the girl who had fallen beneath the rose trellis. Evelyn, perhaps. She turned to leave on. Stopped. Something caught her eye beneath the bed. She stooped slowly, knees creaking, and reached for it. A small leather-bound book, wrapped tightly with string. She didn't open it. Not yet. But she tucked it into her handbag and returned to the hallway. Partridge was waiting. "Find what you needed?" he asked, voice stiff. "Not yet," Miss Marple replied. "But I believe I'm getting closer." They locked the wing again and left the house behind, the east corridor sinking back into silence. That evening, by the fire in her own cottage, Miss Marple untied the string from the book. The leather was cracked, the binding fragile, inside, pages filled with small, meticulous handwriting stretched across the years. It was a journal, and the name scrawled on the inside cover was not Imogen's, it was Eboden. She read the first few lines slowly. "Carefully, I was told, not to speak of my child, that silence would protect us both. But silence becomes its own kind of poison." Miss Marple sat back. There, in the pages of this forgotten diary, lay the truth behind the girl's return. Not just a claim to inheritance, not just a link to a dead estate, but a story long buried, of a woman cast out, of a daughter born in secrecy, and of someone in Lower Davenish who had never wanted the past to be uncovered. The next morning dawned, damp and windless, a pale fog clinging low across the fields of Lower Davenish like a breath withheld. From her parlour window, Miss Marple watched the haze rolling over hedgerows, softening the lines of fences and gates, as though the village itself wished to remain indistinct. She had spent much of the previous evening poring over Evelyn Boat's diary, a worn and fragile volume that whispered secrets with every turned page. The entries, though scattered in date and sometimes fragmentary in tone, told a deeply personal story of Evelyn's lonely years at Davenish Grange, her abrupt dismissal after falling pregnant out of wedlock, and the shame impressed upon her by the very people who had once called her family. What lingered in Miss Marple's mind most were the diary's final pages' reflections, not of bitterness, but of yearning. She must never know how cruel the world can be, Evelyn had written. Let her grow up with freedom, not legacy. The she, of course, had to be Imogen, and someone in the village had feared that freedom, had feared what might be unearthed if the truth came fully to light. Now, seated beside a modest breakfast of stewed prunes and brown toast, Miss Marple reviewed her notes. There were connections forming, but one vital thread still eluded her. Motive: why murder Imogen now, after she had already appeared, spoken publicly, and begun to settle her claim? The answer, she suspected, lay not just in Evelyn's past but in what Imogen might have discovered in the present. And there was one person who might have heard more than they should have, one who saw without being seen. Shortly before noon, Miss Marple set out toward the vicarage, her steps slow but sure. The Reverend and Mrs. Calthorpe were expecting her for tea, and though Mrs. Calthorpe still carried the air of someone recovering from a most untimely scandal in her own garden, she was gracious as ever, ushering Miss Marple into the parlour where the fire crackled dutifully and the lemon biscuits had been arranged with symmetrical care. The constables still poking about, Mrs. Calthorpe sighed as she poured tea. He spent half the morning asking the cook if we ever locked the gate to the rose trellis, as though a locked gate would have stopped such a thing. Miss Marple offered a sympathetic murmur. He seems diligent, if a little heavy-handed. It's the kind of excitement Reeves lives for, the Reverend added, settling into his armchair. He's always been more of a dramatist than a detective. Miss Marple smiled gently. Speaking of dramatics, did either of you happen to notice anything unusual during the fete? Not after the tragedy, but just before it. Mrs. pursed her lips in thought. Unusual. Well, I did see Rosalind Lemmer rather close to the tea-table before everything happened. She had her gloves off, which she almost never does, seemed oddly focused. Yes, on the cups, I think. Or perhaps I imagine that one does tend to rewrite these things in hindsight. Not at all, Miss Marple said calmly. It's precisely the little things often passed over that end up mattering most. The Reverend turned to her. Jane, if I may ask, do you truly believe this was murder? She looked down at her saucer, then back up with soft certainty. Yes, I do. The silence that followed was not surprised so much as solemn. Later, as she left the vicarage and turned down Church Lane, Miss Marple diverted toward the back of the inn. It was time, she thought, to speak again with Alice. The maid had seemed guarded before, and Miss Marple knew enough to recognize when a young woman had more to say, but needed the right moment or the right listener. She found Alice in the side alley, emptying a bin into the dustbin with a look of permanent distraction etched on her face. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, brushing her apron. "I didn't think you'd be back. I find a walk clears the mind." Miss Marple replied pleasantly, "Though sometimes the mind must work around things it's not been told." Alice hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the bin. Miss Marple continued, "It's a terrible thing, being the last person to see someone alive, especially if you feel you missed something, or saw something no one else would believe." Alice looked down, lips pressing together. "I didn't want to say anything," she murmured. "Not to the constable, not to anyone. Sometimes, Miss Marple said gently, not saying is worse. Alice glanced around, then whispered, I heard something. Through the service door, the one near the garden. I wasn't supposed to be listening. I was coming back with the tray. Miss Granville was speaking to someone, but I didn't see who. The voice was low, older. A woman. What did you hear? Miss Marple asked. Alice swallowed. She said, you shouldn't have come back. You should have stayed forgotten. And Miss Granville, she said, I have a right to know. You can't bury the truth forever. Then the other woman said, if you keep asking questions, you'll end up just like her. Miss Marple's breath barely moved, though her eyes were sharp. Did you recognize the voice? No, Alice said, barely audible, but it wasn't Mrs. Calthorpe or Mrs. Banbury Finch, and it didn't sound like Mrs. Lemmer either. It was softer, like someone trying not to be heard. Miss Marple thanked her and walked slowly home, her thoughts tumbling like autumn leaves. There had been a warning and a clear threat. Someone in Lower Davenish had already silenced Evelyn once. Now Imogen had awakened the past and paid the price. But what if the key wasn't who had reason to kill Imogen, but who knew enough to be terrified of what she might reveal? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple returned to Evelyn's diary. Toward the end, a line stood out now with eerie clarity. The nursemaid knee. She saw, but she was silenced too. Miss Marple set the book aside and lit the lamp as the sky darkened. She had always believed that evil in villages was not the loud, gaudy sort of city violence, but rather the soft, creeping rot of secrets held too long. It was rarely hatred that drove murder in such places, it was shame. And someone, somewhere in Lower Davenish, was hiding a shame so old, so painful, they were willing to kill to keep it buried. Dusk fell over Lower Davenish with a chill more befitting November than June, and the fading light cast long, uncertain shadows across the stone face of St. Martin's Church. From her cottage window, Miss Marple could see the bell tower rising above the trees like a silent sentinel, its upper windows catching the last of the sun's rays. She had always found the tower oddly comforting, steadfast, familiar, and always watching, but this evening it seemed a little too still. A sense of unease lingered in the village. Imogen Granville's death had disturbed something beyond just the day's peace. It had stirred the sediment of old sins. Secrets sedimented so deeply into the foundations of the village that few even remembered them, or chose to. Miss Marple sat by the fire, a shawl drawn around her shoulders, reviewing once more the final pages of Evelyn Bowden's diary. She had copied down several lines that hinted at a cover-up, one involving a nursemaid, a locked room, and, most disturbingly, the name of a doctor left unnamed. He said it must never be spoken of. She was young. She was only trying to help, but they told me she disappeared. I think she was sent away. The doctor surely, Dr. Lemmer, father, and now, years later, the only person asking questions had been silenced. A tap at the window broke her thoughts. A small, familiar face peered in the vicarage boy, Peter Calthorpe. She opened the door. Miss Marple, he said breathlessly. Mum said to tell you Mrs. Lemmer's at the church. She left the house a while ago and hasn't come home. The Reverend said it wasn't like her to stay out this late. Miss Marple blinked. The church. She has a key, Mum says. For the bell tower, some historical committee nonsense. Miss Marple thanked him and gently shut the door. Within 5 minutes, she was wrapped in a heavy coat, crossing the green beneath a sky turning violet. The air had turned damp and sharp. As she approached St. Martin's, the tower loomed, ever higher, its windows now dark, save for a faint flicker of light near the base. The wooden door at the side was ajar. Miss Marple stepped inside. The nave was empty, the pews casting long shadows. Candlelight danced faintly near the back, and she followed it through the narrow corridor toward the base of the tower. There, she found Rosalind Lemmer, seated on the stone bench beneath the spiral staircase, a single lantern at her feet and her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, eyes fixed on a point just beyond Miss Marple's shoulder. "I thought you might come," she said, without turning. Miss Marple stepped closer. "It's rather cold to sit alone." "I used to come here when I was younger," Rosalind murmured. "Back when everything was still before father changed, before the Grange was sealed up like a wound." Miss Marple waited. "I saw her once, you know, Evelyn, crying in the corridor outside father's surgery. I was a girl, maybe 13. She said she'd done something terrible, that they'd send her away, and then she vanished." Rosalind turned slowly. "No one ever spoke of it again. Father forbade it. He was a respected man, a war doctor, a gentleman. He said it was for the best, that she'd disgraced the family." Miss Marple's voice was soft, and the nursemaid Elspeth, Rosalind whispered. She knew. She was close to Evelyn. Too close, perhaps, she argued with father. Then she left suddenly. They said she'd taken a position in London. But I always wondered. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed faintly. "And you think Imogen Evelyn's daughter might have found something about Elspeth?" "I don't know," Rosalind said, her voice cracking. "But she came to me, days before the fete. Asked about Evelyn. Asked why no one had ever told her the full truth. And she said she found something in the East Wing. A box beneath a floorboard. Letters, photographs." Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken. "And where are those things now?" "I don't know," Rosalind said miserably. "She said she'd keep them safe. Said she was going to bring it all to light." "Did you tell anyone she'd said that?" "No," Rosalind said, shaking her head, "but someone must have known. Someone who couldn't bear the shame if it came out." Miss Marple laid a hand gently on Rosalind's shoulder. "You must come home, dear. The truth will come out. But you've done the right thing by speaking now." Rosalind nodded slowly and let herself be helped up. Together they stepped out into the cooling night, the village silent but listening. The next morning, Miss Marple sent a quiet message to Constable Reeves, requesting a private word. They met in the vicar's study, where Miss Marple presented Evelyn's diary and a full account of her findings thus far. Reeves listened in stiff, frowning silence, clearly overwhelmed. "This is a lot, Miss Marple," he muttered. "If what you say is true, there could be multiple crimes buried under all this." Miss Marple nodded. "That is the nature of secrets, Mr. Reeves. They rarely travel alone." Reeves rubbed the back of his neck. "We'll need to examine that East Wing again, and track down this missing box of letters. I would also suggest speaking with Alice again," Miss Marple added. "She may remember more than she realizes. And there is one other thing." Reeves looked up. "The teacup," Miss Marple said gently. "It was never conclusively examined, was it?" He blinked. "We didn't find it. The tray was overturned. In panic, some cups shattered." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Then I suggest we find out who retrieved it. Because I don't believe it was lost at all." Outside the study window, the village stirred, shutters opening, carts clattering down the lane, and the bell tower casting its long morning shadow over the green. But Miss Marple no longer looked to the tower for answers. She looked to the people below who had lived too long with the weight of unspoken names. The following day broke damp and colourless, with a pale drizzle threading through the hedgerows of Lower Davenish and leaving the cobbles slick beneath quiet feet. It was the sort of morning when voices carried further than they should, and secrets felt heavier in the air, as though reluctant to remain confined. Miss Marple rose early, stirred not by the weather but by the quiet certainty that a crucial detail had been deliberately obscured. The matter of the missing teacup was not merely an oversight. Someone had taken it. Someone had understood precisely what that cup might reveal. She dressed carefully, pinned her brooch in place, and left the house with her umbrella and a list of names in her mind. She did not need to confront, yet only to listen. Her first stop was the Blue Bell in Imsa. The kitchen was already alive with the bustle of breakfast orders, and Alice was polishing cutlery at the corner table, her brow furrowed in thought. She looked up quickly at the sight of Miss Marple and gave a faint smile. "Good morning, Miss. I thought about what you said. Then perhaps you'll allow me just one more question." Alice nodded. "Of course. The teacup, the one meant for Miss Granville. You said you poured the Darjeeling into it and set it on the tray." Yes, ma'am. I placed it to the side so no one would take it by mistake. I went back in the kitchen to fetch napkins. When I returned, I brought the tray out. Was the cup still where you left it?" Alice's eyes darted away. "I think so." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You think?" Alice hesitated. "There was a second or two when I was near the serving table. I saw Mrs. Lemmer standing close. She looked as though she were adjusting the flowers, but she might have moved something. I didn't really think of it then." "But you thought of it later?" Alice nodded. "When the constable said one of the cups was missing, did you mention this to anyone?" "No, I was scared. If I'd said something and been wrong." Miss Marple reached across and laid her hand lightly on the girl's. "You've done very well, Alice. Very well indeed." She left the inn and made her way up the lane toward the Lemmer house. The drizzle had not ceased, and the scent of wet stone clung to the air like a memory. Rosalind Lemmer opened the door with a look of grim acceptance, as though she'd known this visit was inevitable. "I won't pretend surprise," she said, standing aside. "Come in." The drawing-room was unchanged, dim and still, the tick of the long case clock counting each breath. "I'm afraid I must trouble you again," Miss Marple began gently, "about the fate, about the tea." Rosalind moved slowly to the hearth and stood there, as if warming herself by a fire that no longer burned. "You believe I touched it?" she said, not asking. Miss Marple did not answer at first. She studied Rosalind's posture, the faint twitch at her jawline. "I believe you knew the significance of that cup," she said softly. "I believe you suspected it had been tampered with, perhaps not by you, but you feared someone else had done so." Rosalind turned sharply. "What are you saying?" "You were afraid, Rosalind, not just of Imogen's questions, but of what her death would expose. You tried to remove the cup to protect someone." There was silence, long and taut. Finally, Rosalind exhaled. "It wasn't poison. Not the sort you're thinking of. No arsenic. Nothing you'd detect in an autopsy. But there are plants in the vicarage garden. Rare ones. My father taught me. Digitalis belladonna. Just a trace in the tea would slow the heart. In someone already anxious, it would be enough. And who had access to those plants? Anyone who knew what they were looking for." She walked slowly to a writing desk in the corner, opened a drawer, and withdrew a folded handkerchief. Inside it was a broken piece of china. "I buried it," she said, "behind the chapel wall. But the guilt was worse than the secret. So I went back for it." Miss Marple took the fragment gently, turning it in her hand. Pale pink porcelain, a faint trace of gold at the rim. "You believed you were protecting your father's memory," she said softly. Rosalind's face twisted. "Not just his memory, his legacy. He was a good man in many ways. But he was also proud, ruthless. Even when Evelyn got pregnant, he treated it as a stain. He banished her, paid the nursemaid to disappear. That shame he carried it to his grave. I thought if Imogen brought it out, it would destroy what little remained. Miss Marple said nothing for a long moment. And yet, she said gently, someone else had more to lose. Rosa's eyes widened. You don't think it was me? I think you tried to hide the cup, Miss Marple replied. But I don't think you poisoned it. You may have feared it. But I believe the true culprit wanted Imogen silenced before she revealed what she had found in the East Wing. Rosalind sat heavily in the chair by the fire. Then who? Miss Marple folded the handkerchief and tucked the china piece into her handbag. Someone who knew Evelyn's story would unravel everything. Someone who may have forged documents, shaped identities, controlled access to the house. Someone close to the legal process. Rosalind looked up slowly. Who? Miss Marple didn't reply. Instead, she rose and walked to the door. I believe we shall know soon enough. As she stepped out into the rain-washed lane, her mind churned not with suspicion, but with patterns, with motives, with behavior, and above all with timing. If Imogen had truly found a box in the Grange, where was it now? And who would benefit most from its disappearance? It was time to revisit Mr. Partridge, this time, not with questions, but with quiet certainties Miss Marple intended to test. It was late afternoon by the time Miss Marple approached the modest blue-doored building that housed Partridge and Finch solicitors. The clouds had broken into streaks of gold and pewter, casting long, angled light across the lane, and the scent of rain-soaked earth still clung to the hedges along the path. Miss Marple paused outside for a moment, her gloved hand resting lightly on the iron railing. She was not nervous. She had, over the years, walked into many rooms full of answers, dressed as questions. But there was a certain tension in the air, now something like the moment before a dropped vase hits the ground, fragile, irrevocable. Inside, the clerk, a prim, quiet girl with ink-stained fingertips, looked up with faint surprise. Mr. Partridge is just finishing a letter, Miss Mott. May I? I won't need long, Miss Marple assured her. He'll want to see me. The door to the back office opened shortly after, revealing Hugh Partridge, looking more worn than ever. The past few days had carved subtle lines into his face, and there was a distinct tightness at the corners of his mouth, a man still holding something in. Miss Marple, he said, holding the door wide. I'd be lying if I said I was pleased to see you today. But I imagine you've come for more than a social call. I rarely make calls without reason, Mr. Partridge, she said as she stepped into the office. He gestured toward the seat opposite his desk and sank into his own, folding his hands on a stack of papers. I take it this is about Imogen. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, her voice calm but not without weight. And about Evelyn, and a box she reportedly found before she died. A box of letters, photographs, proof. Partridge's face was still, but the tips of his fingers flexed once against the blotter. I don't know anything about a box. I think you do, Miss Marple said evenly. I think you knew exactly what Imogen had found. I think you followed her into the East Wing when she went exploring, perhaps even before the fate. I think you searched that wing yourself after her death, and I think you have the box now. He gave a thin smile that did not touch his eyes. That's a very serious accusation, Miss Marple. I haven't accused you of anything. Yet there was a silence between them then, not empty but thick with the weight of possibilities. You cared about the estate, she continued. You've been its steward, more or less, since Mrs. Folliot's death. You've taken pride in its legacy, in protecting what was left. When Imogen arrived with papers and claims, You wanted her to be genuine. You wanted to believe it. Partridge looked away. Yes, he said quietly, I did. But then something changed. She asked too many questions, he said after a pause. She came to me with names. People I hadn't heard in decades. Elspeth, for one. She found a journal in the East Wing, Evelyn's, I suppose. She said it didn't match what I'd told her, that the official story didn't hold. She confronted you. No, not directly. She asked me for help. Said the documents I'd filed might have come from the wrong channels. I brushed her off. I said she was reading too much into things, but you knew she wasn't. Partridge pressed his fingers to his temples. She had the truth, and she didn't understand what that meant. She thought it was just family history, a story that would set her free. But it would have ruined everything. The Folliot name, the legacy, and me. I oversaw the trust. If it came out that I'd facilitated her claim on forged or incomplete grounds, I'd lose everything. Miss Marple's voice was cool. So you silenced her? His eyes shot up. No, then who did? I don't know, he said, standing abruptly. But I didn't kill her. I swear it. You were at the fete. You saw the tea. I did, he admitted. I even handed her the cup. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. So you knew which cup was hers. She pointed to it. I was trying to be helpful. I didn't think. He stopped, realizing what he'd just said. Miss Marple gave a soft, sad sigh. But you did think. You saw how nervous she was. You noticed how determined she had become. You might not have poisoned her, Mr. Partridge, but you placed the final piece in her hand. He slumped back into the chair, face strained. I didn't think it was real, he whispered, that anyone would actually go that far. I thought maybe it was all talk. Warnings, resentment. I don't know what I thought. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Where is the box? He reached into a cabinet behind him, drew out a wooden case with tarnished hinges, and placed it on the desk. She gave it to me 2 days before the fete. Asked me to keep it safe. She said she wanted to read through it all once more before speaking with the village council. She never came back for it. Miss Marple opened the lid. Inside were old letters, some signed with Evelyn's neat hand, others scrawled from a woman named Elspeth. There were black and white photographs of Davenish Grange in its younger days. One in particular showing a woman with the same jawline and posture as Imogen, undeniably a Folliot. And tucked beneath it all was a half-completed letter from Imogen herself, dated the morning of the fete. If anything happens to me, I want it known I was never ashamed of who I came from. My mother was cast out, but she never gave up on decency. I only hope the people who feared her truth will have the courage to live with it now. Miss Marple closed the box and folded her hands. I believe this should be turned over to the authorities. Partridge nodded slowly. I know. Outside, the last light of day had fallen across the rooftops. The church bell rang 6 times. The village, as ever, continued on, tired, bruised, but breathing. Miss Marple rose and smoothed her gloves. One final question, Mr. Partridge. Yes, who else knew Imogen gave you this box? Partridge's pause was brief, but it was long enough. Rosalind, he said at last. She was there when I took it from her. She stayed quiet. Miss Marple's eyes remained steady. And she wasn't the only one watching that afternoon. The morning that followed was bright and clear, as though the weather had finally tired of its mourning. Dew clung to the grass in the vicarage garden, and the rose trellis, so innocent in its bloom, so terrible in memory, stood calmly beneath the golden light, its petals unfurling as if nothing had ever happened beneath its shade. But Miss Marple knew better. The garden remembered. The garden is always remembered. She arrived at the vicarage promptly at 10, having requested a small, informal gathering, just the relevant parties, she had said, with the quiet authority of someone rarely questioned in such matters. The Reverend Harold Calthorpe had been happy to oblige, though his wife remained anxious, suspecting rightly that something significant was about to unfold. The group assembled in the garden: Hugh Partridge, pale and tight-lipped; Rosalind Lemmer, wrapped in a heavy shawl despite the warmth; Colonel Easterbrook, ever dignified; Mrs. Banbury Finch, who had insisted she had nothing to do with any of this but came anyway, for the sake of appearances; and Alice, the inn maid, who lingered at the garden's edge, eyes wary but wide with curiosity. Miss Marple stood near the trellis, her posture as unassuming as ever, her gloved hands folded gently before her. "Thank you all for coming," she began softly. "I know the past days have been difficult for us all. A young woman died here under mysterious circumstances, yes, but also under the weight of a history few of us have wanted to revisit." She paused, allowing the breeze to speak for a moment. "I have, over these last days, listened to accounts, followed paths, and pieced together a truth that I believe explains not only Imogen Granville's tragic death, but also the silence that preceded it. And I feel it is time that silence was broken." There was a shifting of feet, a rustle of skirts and coats. No one interrupted. "Miss Granville," Miss Marple continued, "was indeed the daughter of Evelyn Bowden, once of Davenish Grange. Evelyn was expelled from the family under disgrace, as some here will remember, though not all knew the full story. She bore a child in Canada, far from the scandal, and raised that child to believe in truth and dignity. That child, by here seeking answers, not for wealth, not for revenge, but for a name." She looked gently at Rosalind Lemmer. "Miss Lemmer, you remember the child Evelyn left behind. You suspected, perhaps even knew, who Imogen truly was. You feared what her return might mean for your father's legacy. But I do not believe you intended for her harm. I believe you tried to cover the traces afterward to protect a version of the past you could live with. You removed the teacup after the fact, but someone else made it deadly." Rosalind's chin quivered, but she said nothing. Miss Marple turned next to Hugh Partridge. "You facilitated her claim, Mr. Partridge. Perhaps you even hoped it was genuine. But when the truth emerged, when you realized that Evelyn's story conflicted with the narrative carefully preserved by the trustees, you hesitated, and in your hesitation, Imogen entrusted you with a box, letters, photographs, even a fragment of the Grangers' concealed history. You did not destroy it, and for that, we owe you something like mercy." Partridge gave a curt nod, looking anywhere but at the others. "But you were not the only one who knew she had begun digging into the past." Now Miss Marple's gaze moved to the edge of the group, to the one figure who had not yet spoken, Colonel Easterbrook. The colonel raised his head, brow furrowed, in dignified confusion. "Madam, I hardly think you were there at the fete," Miss Marple said gently. "You took a teacup, not the one meant for you." Alice noticed, so did I. And more importantly, so did Imogen. East stiffened. "You're implying, I'm stating," Miss Marple said, with quiet firmness, "that you had both motive and opportunity. Years ago, before Evelyn was sent away, you were a frequent visitor to the Grange. Evelyn was young, impressionable, and then suddenly she was gone." A silence fell over the group. Miss Marple continued. "The letters in the box made clear that Evelyn had once loved someone she believed would protect her. She never named him. But there are very few people who still live in this village who were close to the Folliats at that time, even fewer with the power to quietly erase someone's existence. Colonel Easterbrook's face was stone. "I found a photograph," Miss Marple said softly, "in the box. It shows Evelyn on the terrace, and standing just behind her, toward the camera, was a man in uniform. You were already courting Miss Edith Turnbridge at the time, I believe. You couldn't risk a scandal. She would have destroyed everything," Easterbrook said suddenly, his voice a low growl. "The Grange, the name, the dignity of the family. What was I supposed to do? Admit I'd fathered a child with a servant's niece?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "She didn't want anything from you. She never asked. But her daughter, the truth. She was going to announce it publicly," he hissed. "Go to the press. Bring it all out like dirty linen on a wash line. That girl didn't understand the damage she'd do. And so you poisoned her," Miss Marple said, her voice no louder than a sigh. "You used foxglove. A trace in her tea was all it took. Then you waited, calmly, while the village descended into confusion." Easterbrook's shoulders filled not with shame, but with fatigue. "I served this village for 40 years, he said. "I kept its traditions, its history intact." "You kept your secret," Miss Marple said softly. Constable Reeves, who had been standing quietly by the side gate on Miss Marple's suggestion, now stepped forward. "I'll take it from here, Colonel." There was no resistance, only silence. Rosalind turned away, hand pressed to her mouth. Alice wept silently. Hugh Partridge stared at the rose trellis, and Miss Marple stood alone at the centre, calm as ever. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and the air turned golden again, Miss Marple sat in her parlour with the diary on her lap. The village would move on, as it always did. But there would be a quiet change in the air, as though something long buried had been set to rest. She turned the last page, ran her fingers along the edge, and murmured aloud to herself, "Truth, like roses, sometimes blooms in places long left wild." And then she folded the book closed.